My name is Finian Garrity, and I am a faculty in Religious Studies, Contemplative Studies, and South Asian Studies. It's just I'm so excited to be able to host this event, and I just want to give a special thanks and shout out to Jamila, who said to me by email after the first class, "Hey, you were quoting my grandmother during that lecture." And so that was the inspiration for this event, and I'm so glad that it's come to fruition. With such an accomplished and successful person as Madhur Jaffrey, it's difficult to know where to start in this role of introducing her. She's an actress, a food and travel writer, an author of award-winning and best-selling cookbooks. She was signing autographs in the hallway of Watson when I walked in. That's how I knew it was. I knew it was you. And then, a host of this kind of seminal television show, Indian Cooking. Author of this amazing memoir, which Climbing the Mango Trees, which my students are reading from this week in preparation for this class. So I guess I would say that Jaffrey's life in food has placed her in the midst of just so many pivotal and exciting historical, cultural, and literary events. Just to name a few, she grew up in the twilight of the British Raj and lived through the partition of India, and she's going to be offering some insights about that period in her life today. She starred in Merchant and Ivory's classic film, Shakespeare Walla. She introduced the world to Indian cuisine with her timeless invitation to Indian cooking from 1973, I believe. And most recently, perhaps less pivotal, but very entertaining, she made a cameo as a street-savvy grandmother in the video for Nani by the hip-hop artist Mr. Cardamom. And I don't know if you know, but nowadays when you Google your name, that's one of the first things that comes up. And then Ever the Pioneer, her latest book, Instantly Indian, takes on the Instant Pot. And I have to say, I'm personally looking forward to that one because we do have an Instant Pot in my house, but I can never, ever get the rice to turn out correctly.
There's a chance.
Okay, good. So I'm eager for your instruction. So there's so much more to say, but maybe I'll just leave you with a kind of personal anecdote that I think attests to Miss Jaffrey's influence. Growing up, in the exciting state of Connecticut, I spent a lot of time in the kitchen of my grandmother, who was an Irish-American woman from the Bronx. And looking back, I realized that I've tried a lot of foods in my life for the first time sitting at her table. And this included, on one particular afternoon, Indian food, right? This was kind of like something of a novelty in the late 70s, early 80s in suburban Connecticut. I think it was a dal dish of some kind. I don't really remember, but what I truly remember is loving it and then being obsessed with the book that somehow was its impetus, right? And the book in particular, I had the vision of the cover in my mind, so I spent some time online today tracking it down. It was that beautifully illustrated volume, World of the East, Vegetarian Cooking. So for me personally, I can never think of Madhur Jaffrey without thinking of that afternoon and sitting in the kitchen with my grandmother and kind of, getting a taste of this whole new world. So with that, I'd just like to turn it over to you and welcome you to Brown.
Thank you so much. I'll start at the very beginning, the beginning for me at any rate. I was born in Delhi, the capital city, which if I need to show it to you on a map, it's somewhere around here in this, roughly this area. And I was born in a Hindu household, comfortable, large household. And the very first act that happened to me was that my grandmother walked into the room with a jar of honey, and she dipped her little finger in the jar and wrote Om on my tongue with it. Now, Om has many meanings, but one of them is I am, I exist. So that's how I was introduced into this world. Now, just 3 years earlier, on the 6th of April in 1930, I was born in 1933. 3 years earlier, in 1930, Mahatma Gandhi, we call him Mahatma or great soul Gandhi, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi was his name, and he was living in an ashram in Ahmedabad, which is in Gujarat, in the state of Gujarat, somewhere around here. And he had decided that he would walk with his followers, anyone who cared to join him, to a town of Dandi, which is just further along to the coast. And here he would do something that was an act of nonviolent civil disobedience. And this was called the Salt March. The British had passed, they were our rulers at that time. When I was born, it was the time of the British Raj, and the British were ruling us and doing what they wanted with us. And one of the things that they imposed on us was the salt tax. Now, according to this rather odious salt tax, we could neither collect salt, nor make salt, nor sell salt. And more than that, they had added huge taxes to it. And so anyone who wanted to cook the simplest of things couldn't get the salt. They couldn't afford the salt. So that all over the whole country, the whole nation, people were suffering from not being able to put salt in their food. And Gandhi was very upset that this is our country and we can't buy salt, we can't make salt. So he decided that he would do this march to Dandi. Of course, it was a very marked occasion. Everybody knew it was going to happen. The whole country was ready and waiting for it, and so were the British. So by the time he arrived in Dandi on the coast, they had, when the waves came in, they left crystals of salt, and this is how you could scoop it up from the top and collect it and then make salt. Well, they had crushed it. They'd already crushed the salt into the earth. So there was no way he could collect the crystals, but he did. He just scooped up earth and salt and put it together, and that in itself was an act of civil disobedience. And we call that our salt march. It was you could compare it to the Boston Tea Party. In fact, they're very similar. We were rebelling against a tax put on something that was ours. And so, of course, 60,000 people apparently in all of India were arrested, as was Gandhi. He was put in jail as well for this. But what happened was that it made him a prominent Indian, this thin, slight man who wore nothing but loincloth and looked very humble and innocent, was a smart enough lawyer to know what he was doing. And it brought him to the front of view for the Britons. And from then on, they began to recognize him as a power that they constantly had to deal with, not only him, but this whole business of nonviolent civil obedience, which we call satyagraha, became recognized as a natural way to fight for independence without killing anybody along the way. The British had been killing us too, among other things. So this was a new way that he started, and this was called the Salt March. Now, I was born in 1933 at a time when India was in a high state of agitation. We were fighting for our independence, but there were many forces pulling in different directions. We didn't just get together as a happy country and say, we'll all fight together and we'll get our independence. We weren't together. We were in different groups, split, different thinking on different sides. So what were the major groups? One of the major groups was the Congress Party. And Gandhi belonged to this group, and so did Jawaharlal Nehru, who became our first prime minister. So did Maulana Azad. I believe he became the education minister. I can't remember. But he was a Muslim. So there were Hindus and Muslims and people of different faiths collected in the Congress Party. Now, there was another party that was called the Muslim League, that was led by a Muslim, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. And his dream was to have a separate nation for just Muslims. And this was to be a land taken from what was India and made into a separate country, Pakistan, which would be a land for just Muslims. So these two parties were sort of at it, and the British, in their wonderful way of using one person against another person, playing one person up against another person, let us clash, encourage the clashing. And we were all waiting. When I was born, everyone was waiting to see what this decision was going to turn out to be. But we were very torn. We were not a united country fighting for independence. Now, again, I thought I would deal with this whole thing in a more personal manner and tell the story from my point of view so that you would understand it in a more personal kind of way rather than a general history. So then, who were we? I was a Hindu, but we are all more than that. You see, this is the complication in India. And Muslims are more than just Muslims. They can be, a Muslim can be a Shia, he can be a Sunni, he can belong to the Bohri community, he can belong to the Memon community, the Hoja community. So within Muslims themselves, there are different groups. Within Hindus, there is, of course, the caste system. And again, I'll approach the caste system from very directly my point of view. So my grandmother, in our rather large house, had a prayer room, a puja room that she called. And we used to collect in it for prayers. And as kids, we didn't know what we were. You know, you don't really know what you're doing. You just do what your elders tell you to do. So on one particular day of the year, and this usually fell around October, November, and it was the Festival of Dussehra, where we would be asked by my grandmother. She would say, okay, give me all your pens and pencils and bottles of quink, bring them to the prayer room. And she would tell the men, bring all your guns. All the men in our family hunted. They were shikaris, as we call them. They went for duck and deer and all these things. This was what the men did. So they were supposed to bring their guns and bring them in and put them in the prayer room. And then my grandmother there would be always holy basil, tulsi, just growing outside in little pots on both sides of the entrance to the prayer room. And she would make a dish, a drink, which had cold milk, cold yogurt, a little honey or sugar, and the tulsi leaves for aroma and flavoring. And this was called Charnamrit, or from the feet of the god, the amrit, the holy nectar from the feet of the god. And this was offered to everyone. So I used to think, what the heck is going on here? Why is my grandmother asking for my bottle of quink? What on earth does it mean? But much later on, I began to understand that they're in the Indian Hindu caste system. Now, you know all about that. You all know technically what the caste system is. So at the top of the heap are the Brahmins, the religious priests and scholars. They were allowed to read and write and be scholars. And then below them are the Kshatriyas, who are the warriors and kings, who have guns and who can fight. Then there are the Vaishyas, who are the traders and who work the farms. And then there are the menial workers, who do the lowest end of the work, and at the end of the totem pole are the Shudras. So this is the basic caste system. And I don't know when my particular caste or subcaste came into being, but I'm sure it was a group of people who said, we want to read and write, but not religion. We don't want religion anywhere mixed in this. We want to read books, we want to read novels, we want to read poetry. Where does that all come in? So what happened, the story, the legend goes that Brahma, god of the heavens, was asked by Yama, the god of the underworld. He said, I need somebody to take care of justice, to keep all records, to write and keep everything in order that is going on. We want a history of what's going on here. So who's going to do this? So Brahma said he produced from his own body this young man who came with a bottle of ink and some pens and a sword. And he was called a twice-born Kshatri, so he could be a warrior, he could be a king, but he could write. So I always say that in our community, we as a community are born with ink in our veins. We are writers, we are record keepers. And strangely enough, that's what I'm doing. And I don't know how it happened, how this came to pass, but that seems to be what I'm doing and what many people in my family have done. So anyway, that's how our particular caste was born. So when you try and simplify anything in India, you will always be wrong, because you cannot simplify. You just cannot. It's just, there's too many sides and angles and ways to look at things. And even I cannot make a dramatic statement about India, this is this, because it'll never be true. There'll always somebody who says, but what about this? And so India is a country like that. So now we've established that there are differences amongst the Hindus, there are differences amongst the Muslims, and here we are at a stage when I'm born fighting for independence. But if you look back, the greatest influence perhaps on India, which is basically as a country, Vedantic in their beliefs to begin with in prehistory. Then they became Buddhists, Hindus, and Jains. Buddhists and Jains both believed in the not killing anybody and living a life of freedom from killing and trying to attain oneness with God. So before AD 1, this was pretty much the case, as you can't generalize, but pretty much the case. Then a whole lot of people felt that there was too much competition with Buddhism and Jainism. And what about us? Everybody was forgetting the rest of us. So Hinduism began at that particular time and said, we can also won't kill anybody, look at us. And we won't kill the cow, we won't do this, we won't do that, and we are very good people too. So Hinduism also had begun in prehistory, just after prehistory. And it is at around the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries that the people who were going to influence us the most began coming into India, and these were the Muslims. Islam had started in the Middle East and was spreading, and its first direction was towards us, towards India. And by 1193, we had a Muslim ruler called Qutbuddin Aibak, and he was in charge of Delhi and the ruler of Delhi. Now, this kind of Islamic rule went on for a long time. It didn't end really till the 19th century. So we had a long period of Muslim effect on our Hindu body, as it were. One of the first things that happened, I don't know if you've traveled in India, if you've been to the wonderful temples at Konark and Khajuraho, where there are these beautiful women all over, plastered all in stone all around the buildings. Beautiful. They have lots of jewelry on, lovely hairdos, and very little clothing. Because before the coming of the Muslims, Hindu women did not wear much clothing. It was a hot climate. They wore very simple little loincloths, but their breasts were bare. They wore jewels if they could afford them, and that was the general look. But that slowly began to change. So by the time you get to my aunt's time, there's a whole different system. The women are already in the sort of parda system. They cannot be seen. So when my two youngest aunts, my father's youngest sisters, went to college, they went to a college called St. Stephen's College. That took very few women. It was mostly men, but they did take some women. And they did go to this college. They would be escorted there with somebody holding sheets in front of them through the narrow lanes of the city so that they could get into a phaeton that was on a wider street, and this phaeton would take them to St. Stephen's College, and they would get out, and if they had to play tennis, which they did want to, so they had to play against each other because there were no other men in the college at the same time. And when they took their classes, they were told to sit right in front so that nothing could happen to them and the professor could keep an eye on them. So this kind of system really continued till the time that I was born. This kind of feeling that women should be behind the parda, behind the curtain, as it were. And this started around the 12th century with the coming of the first Muslims. And so that is an interesting aspect that changed with the coming of the Muslims. The other thing that changed was our food. And this is, again, very interesting. So the Muslims who came were Turkic, or they were from Persia, or they were from the parts of Afghanistan, northern part of Afghanistan, and they yearned for their fruit. They yearned for their melons and their pomegranates and their grapes. So they started bringing in, ordering in, trading for all these items to come to India. So a whole trade started for India that continued until my grandfather's time. My grandfather imported Shiraz grapes from Persia and made his own wine in his cellar. So it continued till that time. Of course, when Pakistan was formed, all this ended. But we got fruit from that part of the world for centuries and centuries and centuries. And that started with the coming of Islam to India. But other foods were coming in as well. I don't have the time to go into all kinds of foods that were coming in, but let's just take one of them. How many of you know what a samosa is? All right. For those who don't, the samosa is a little triangular kind of pastry. Does anybody know the origin of the samosa? Okay, I will tell you. So, the samosa, let's go to Baghdad, what I call Baghdad, Baghdad, in the 10th century, when it is absolutely at its scintillating height. It's the greatest court in the world at that time. There are mathematicians, there are scientists, there are musicians, there are poets, all kinds of people are in the court. And it's a very exciting time because many discoveries are being made in mathematics and science, and it's a grand court to be in. And one day in this court comes a man from a town that we all know now, Mosul, and he recites a poem about something that already existed in that part of the world called Sambu Saj or Sambu Sak. That was the name at that time. And it's a poem about what it was then. And I won't read you the whole thing, though it's great fun to read it. I'll just read you the ingredients. So, take first the meat, red, soft to the touch, and mince it with fat, not overmuch. Then add an onion, cut in circles clean, a cabbage, very fresh, exceeding green, and season well with cinnamon and rue. Of coriander, add a handful too. After that, of cloves, the very least, and of finest ginger and of pepper best. 2 handfuls of Palmyra salt, and these are the ingredients. Then it goes on to describe how you make the dough part of it. You roll out a dough in a circle, and then you put the stuffing in, you close it, you docket it, as this says, with your nails, and then you fry it. But how do you serve it. That's very interesting. So what happened? This same sambusak became a samosa in India, and Hindus, as many of them were vegetarians, said, we are not going to do the meat part, but what can we do? Potatoes, also from the New World. We didn't have potatoes. They had come from the New World. We'll put potatoes in and peas in and make it nice and spicy, so it's Indian, and then we'll serve it. And many Muslims had either did that or they did the minced meat inside with a lot of spices and made it that way. But the idea of the cabbage somehow got lost in the shuffle and it fell out. But how did they all eat it? We eat it with hot, spicy chutneys made out of mint and coriander or tamarind. But how did they eat it? And I'll just continue with the poem. In the 10th century, how they ate it. Last, ladle out a thin tureen where appetizing mustard smeared had been, and eat with pleasure, mustard it about, this tastiest food of hurried diner out. So it's takeout. It's a takeout dish at that time, and it's eaten with a lot of mustard. Nothing hot and spicy except mustard, which is hot and spicy. So that is how the samosa originated and how it came to us, and we slowly changed it over time, as we did with everything. All foods change over time, and this we are talking about centuries and centuries. So this is how it changed eventually. So now, if you remember, I had told you that our ancestors were bookish people, my ancestors, but there was another side to them as well. And that was a side that made them be called by everyone around them sharabi kababis. Now, sharab is liquor, kabab is a kebab, but it stands for all good food. So we were known also for eating and drinking. I remember a cousin of mine, a very beautiful, green-eyed cousin, who walked with great lethargy and sexiness. She was absolutely beautiful, very heavy. And she was asked by somebody said to her, you're all just, you're half Muslims, you people. She said, well, I don't know about that, but I don't like sweets very much. If I'm still hungry, I just eat another kofta, which is a meatball. She said, I just put another kofta in my mouth. And so this was the thinking in my particular community, that the things to eat were quite Muslim in their origin. And the reason for this is very understandable and simple. So what happened was that we began as a family, the men in the family started after the early Muslim period ended and the Mughals came to rule the country, which was in the early 1600s. We decided that we would work for the Mughals. And it didn't, it wasn't, you couldn't just get into the court, because this was a time when you had to walk into the court with your eyes down, you couldn't look up at the emperor, and everybody sort of believed this particular Persian saying that should the king say, it is night at noon, be sure to cry, behold the moon. So that was the general thinking of the court. And the emperor, by the time Shah Jahan became the emperor in the 17th century, he was one of the richest men in the entire world, richer than the Tudors, richer than anyone in China, very, very rich. And he had this peacock throne, which was gold and encrusted with gems, fat gems, including the Kohinoor diamond. Eventually, you know where the Kohinoor diamond is. I always want to go and steal it. It's in the Queen's crown, broken into pieces. It's not even a whole thing anymore. So it was all taken away. But anyway, at that time, it was still sitting embedded in Shah Jahan's throne. So nobody could just walk in. So, and in terms of food, the most amazing foods were being eaten at that particular time, which the Mughals, now the Mughals are later than the early Muslims that came. They came through Persia. They were Mongols originally. So from Central Asia, they came into India, but through Persia. And Persia had a very civilizing influence on them. Persia was a marvelous country with great food and great paintings, and they were civilized, thoroughly civilized people. So when they came through, a little bit of civilizing happened to them, and they changed, and their food actually became, rather than the rough Mongol food that they ate as they rode along, became very civilized and absolutely marvelous. And you can get Mughlai food, or Mughal food, or Mughal food, up to this day. So what were the kinds of dishes they served? They served things like Dopiaza. Now, Dopiaza means you take an equal quantity of meat and an equal quantity of onions, and then you cook them together with spices like cardamom and cinnamon and things like that. And it is a wonderful dish that is cooked. Certainly, I cook it even to this day. So it's a dish that is still alive and very current. So that was one of the dishes. Then they made saag, which is usually was spinach, but again, it had a lot of sliced onions in it, and it had ginger and black pepper and cardamom and things like that. But then one dish, and we were talking about it earlier, that they made, and it was a style of cooking that came to us with the Muslims, and those were what we call dampukht dishes. Now, the British didn't know how to say any word, Indian, called it dampokht. So dampokht dishes were dampukht dishes, and these were, you took a big pot, and you could make many, you could make rice this way, you could make other things this way, but what they often did was take meat, rub it with yogurt and ginger and very aromatic spices and salt, and then put it in a dish, put the lid on, then close the dish with they made like a snake with dough, and they put the dough all around, so they're sealing it shut. And they sealed it shut, and then they put embers on the top and embers on the bottom. It was like making an oven. It was like an oven. And then they cooked it slowly for a long time, and those were these dampukh dishes. So they came into vogue with the Mughals, and they were made all over Mughal India and other parts of India, and they are absolutely marvelous to this day. We still make them. So these were the sort of traditional Mughal dishes. So what happened was that the men in our family, not just the first one who went, and the first person who went to work there was a man called Raja Raghunath Bahadur. And he went in, he obviously couldn't walk in himself, but he was brought in by the finance minister, and the finance minister eventually hired him as his deputy. And when the finance minister died during the next king's time, Aurangzeb's time, my ancestor became the finance minister of the court. But he was not the only one. He was at the top of the ladder, top rung of the ladder. There were many others working in the Muslim court who eventually they're all probably members of my family, their ancestors of members of my family. And their work was the ink in the veins, was keeping records. They spoke Persian fluently. They learned how to speak it. They kept the records. They administered districts around the country. And as a job, it was basically keeping the history straight, writing everything down. This was their job, even in the most menial capacity, in the courts of the Mughal rulers. And I think what happened then, that the men would come home to their wives. Now, the wives, nobody kept records of the wives. No, women are not mentioned. We have a family history. No woman is mentioned in that. So all we know is what the men did. So we assume that the men came in and the women cooked for them. And the women cooked everything that the men liked. They cooked the Mughal food. They even ate the Mughal food. But they never gave up their own Hindu dishes that had come down to them from tradition. For example, they still made the chila, which is a pancake made out of mung beans, which you soak and make into a batter and make a pancake. They still made their various dishes with beans and eggplant and various things like that, using all the very traditional Indian spices like mustard seeds and cumin seeds and things like that. So that continued apace. So here were families developing, and we've always told we are half Muslim because of all this. Anyway, we, in my particular family, grew up with eating Mughlai food and at the same time Hindu food. So that was our particular family tradition. So now we have this other influence at work, which is the British. So we were, we could be eventually, half Hindu, half Muslim, and half British, if you can be that. Because the British influence was just as strong. They came in with the signing of the East India Company Charter in 1600 by Queen Elizabeth. So they got their charter, and they came as tradesmen. That was the whole guise. And initially, I'm sure they intended to be tradesmen. But there were other people trading too. There were the French, there were the Dutch. Everyone wanted Indian spices and Indian silks and all kinds of other Indian goodies. So what was going to happen? They were fighting each other, they were fighting the Indians, and but there was an interesting thing happening again in terms of food. What they were introducing to India, and you saw more of it as time goes on, is something that we call double roti. And double roti is double bread. And double bread, our breads are flat. Double roti is like that. So it's a loaf of bread. So they introduced to India what Indians began to call double roti, which is a loaf of bread. So that was one big thing. So we would eat our food with our own chapatis, our flatbreads like tortillas, but every now and then we say, oh, we're eating it with double roti today. So that was a kind of fancy thing that we could do. Again, in many families, especially like mine, we would have a breakfast, which was an English breakfast, with bacon and sausages and fried eggs and grilled tomatoes and things like that. We ate porridge sometimes for breakfast. So, and before a dinner, we could have a soup, which was very English, and end up with a tart of some kind. It was a very Indian tart. I remember ours was jam tart. The cook made jam tart. And jam tart was just pastry with jam on top. And we all thought it was the greatest thing. And the taste was actually quite wonderful. So our food was getting mixed, and it was getting sort of the British side to it as well. So we had lived with my father in a city called Kanpur. And if you ever study, for example, the Indian Mutiny, you will find that Kanpur is one of the places where the mutiny was very bad. So I have to tell you that the British were there, and first they were there to just get as much loot as possible in terms of trade and whatever they could collect. Then slowly they began to acquire land, and eventually the crown wasn't too happy with all of this. So around this time, we had what is called by the British, the Indian Mutiny. This is 1857, and a date that every Indian knows. And in this mutiny, it started because of unhappiness that the rulers had with all, which the people in India had, with all aspects of British rule, and it somehow got synthesized into this one grievance or set of grievances that had to do with the army, with the sepoys, the soldiers in the army. Now, a lot of people the British had to, they didn't have enough of their own soldiers. They couldn't possibly for this huge country. And by this time, they were really in charge of this, the whole country. If you just take out the top, Kashmir and Punjab, the rest of the country, they were really ruling or in charge of in some way or the other. They were saying, you can't be little king here, we're getting your son, you go out. They were manipulating the rulers, the local rulers. They were manipulating every aspect of Indian life. So they were doing this with an army that was basically Indian. And a lot of them were Brahmins or Hindus who were of upper castes. So when they went to fight in Afghanistan, where nobody has done any good ever by going there, so they asked us, the Indian sepoys, to wear sheepskin. It's very cold. Sheepskin coats, jackets. And Hindus didn't want to wear them and rebelled. So then in other places, there were other problems. They were bringing in new rifles into the regiments. And these new rifles had bullets, which had to be greased before they were put in. And they were, the soldiers were complaining that the grease was either pork fat or cow fat. In both cases, either Hindus were annoyed or Muslims were annoyed, one or the other. So a rebellion eventually started, and the British eventually crushed it brutally, horribly. In Delhi, in my city, they killed as many people as possible. My grandfather's grandfather, who lived in the old city, his house was, I know, completely looted. But he was just one person. He wasn't killed, but many other people were killed. And all of Delhi, all the citizens of Delhi were driven out, go out, don't come back in, were driven out, at least for a week or so. So it was, and they killed, and it was just a horrible time. So it was after this mutiny, which Indians call our first war of independence. Nehru called it our first war of independence. It was decided by the East India Company and the Crown that the Crown would just basically take over. And that's when the Raj, as it were, the Raj of Queen Victoria and all her followers started. And we became a British colony. Not that we weren't before, we were in many ways, but we became a proper British colony. And so the British were very much there in our lives. And when my father was posted to Kanpur, we had to decide what kind of schools my father would send us to. It was interesting. He looked around, there were schools that were all with Indian languages that you could go to. There's such a choice at that time. But he wanted a certain kind of sophistication for his girls. He wanted a certain westernization for his girls at that time as well. So in the end, he opted, strangely enough, for a convent, which had Irish and German nuns, which is very interesting because we were not Catholic, we were not Christian. So we weren't allowed to go to chapel, which always smelled so nice, and I wanted to go to chapel, but we weren't allowed. So instead, we were given what were called Bible history classes. And so I loved that. I loved reading the Bible. That was fine with me. So that's what we did. And it was an odd period of in-between kind of decisions. And then my father went on to come to Delhi. He decided that he was leaving Kanpur and coming to Delhi. And there he first tried to put me, I was the only one because my sisters were already in a school in the hills, they'd gone there. So I was the only one he had to think about particularly. So first he put me in a convent that was segregated. Of course I hated it. And then he took me out of that. So where was he going to put me in the end? It was a question that he had to ask himself, and we talked about it. So in the end, guess what? He put me in what was a missionary school that was a Parda school. Now, I don't know if you even understand what I'm saying. It was a school run by English missionaries for Muslim girls in particular who wore the veil in some form. And these were inner city girls. And so what would happen was that a van pulled by a horse would go into the narrow lanes of the old city, pick up these girls who would be wearing a full burqa, which is from head to toe garment. They would get into this little van, and it would go picking up all the girls and come to the school, and then these girls who'd been stifling in this little van would jump out one after the other. I remember watching them open the door and start jumping out, and they would run through the school door and start taking off their burqas as they were running. And there was a special place, a special corridor with hooks on both sides, where they went and hung all their green and white and black burqas. And some of these girls were my best friends. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about them. But before I tell you about what happened in school, rather quickly, I would also like to fill you in on one thing which I forgot to mention, that while the British were there, as I said, people from Portugal, people from France, all these people were attacking India. But what the Portuguese had done was they were great traders. And when they had come to South India, to Kerala, which is, let's see, I'll never find it. Anyway, oh yeah, Kerala's down here, along here, on the coast. So they traded right here, in this spot right here. And they brought, among many other things, chilies, red chilies, which were going to transform our cuisine completely. Before that, what had they used before? In Kerala in particular, they grew black pepper. And I've seen old recipes, and I've gone to countries where old Kerala recipes are still used, where they have 2 tablespoons of crushed black pepper in a recipe. So that is where the cooking changed from the use of black pepper to the use of red chilies. And red chilies spread like wildfire across the whole country. So this is going on at the same time. Now, I go back to school. So here we are. There are all these Muslim girls coming and hanging their burqas on hooks in the corridors. So some of them were my very, very best friends. And 2 of them, Abida and Zahida, I think they were not twins. I think they were sisters. But they were born so close together that they always were in every class together with me. And I had adored them. They were very bright. Their math was superb. And they would give me great help with mine, because every time the teacher started with, if it takes 6 hours for a train to go 146 miles, I would say, okay, can somebody give me a good book to read? And it was just beyond me. This was not my cup of tea at all. And they would see me through ratios and square roots and everything else, and they were very sweet. The other thing that they taught me was a kind of embroidery. I love to embroider. And it was called kashida. And this method of embroidery I had never known. It's a particular kind of stitch where the front and the back appears exactly the same. And you have to spend hours and probably closeted somewhere doing this, because it takes forever to do. So I loved them. And they were very gentle at the same time. So these were amongst my 2 best friends. Then I had other friends from other religions. There was Sudhabala Jain, who was like me. Her family grew up in the inner city of Delhi and then moved out into New Delhi, into Lachan's New Delhi. And she was there, and she was a Jain, another religion. Then there was Pamela. Her name was Pamela. She was a Punjabi, but from Delhi. And so each girl would bring different kinds of food, and we would meet together for lunch. So we would go through that little corridor where the shrouds were hanging, and to the back where the netball courts were, and beyond to a little mound with trees, so there was shade, and we would sit and eat. So Abida and Zahida brought this wonderful, they always brought meat of some kind. And what I loved the most was their saag gosht, which is spinach and meat. And it's not that we didn't make saag gosht in our house. And this is why I say, that the cooking of different religions, even if it's the same dish in India, is different. And what is the difference? I don't really know. It's a sensibility. It's like so many more seconds on the fire, or you put the lid on, or you don't put the lid on. But it's in the hand, we say. It's a different hand that is cooking the dish. And I would always remember the taste of that, because the other thing that happened was sometimes it would congeal a little bit because it was winter or something. So they would light a little kerosene stove and heat the food on that. And the food of the meat and spinach combined with the smell of the match and the kerosene, there was some heady quality to all this. And I just absolutely loved it. So what would Sudha bring now? Sudha was a Jain, believing in the non-killing of any insect, animal, anything else. So of course there was no meat, but she didn't mind all of us sharing her food. So she was open to that. And she also never brought anything with tomatoes, because tomatoes reminded her of blood. The redness of it from a tomato was like blood. She never brought any root vegetables, but pulling anything by its root killed the whole plant. So there were restrictions in her food, but her food was delicious. If she brought peas and beans or whatever it was always yummy, and I wanted everybody else's food. Pramila, who was Punjabi, brought very often parathas, sometimes stuffed with potatoes, which had been introduced again by the Europeans. And in fact, one Indian told a bishop in Calcutta, after the potatoes were introduced, that the best thing the white man has given us is the potato. So she already now had potatoes, and they would appear in many hundreds and thousands, actually, of dishes. India makes more things with potatoes than almost anyone else. So they were very much there. So I don't know, whatever my mother gave us was never good enough, because I always liked everyone else's food. They liked mine, so I said, you just take it all. I don't want to eat mine. And I ate everyone else's food. And it was absolutely delicious for all of us. So now I think I will end now, because my time seems to be going up. But I'd like to mention a few things that happened after that. Now, the talk of partition was very much on the horizon by 1945, 1946. It was really getting to be crunch time, and we knew that there was going to be a partition. And World War II, where many Indians had fought, at least that was coming to a close, or had come to a close, but partition loomed like... So what happened in our particular class to begin with? The minute the talk of partition started, it was like, whoop, like a icicle came down and split the Hindus, Sikhs, Jains on one side, Muslims on the other. I was in the middle, but both sides hated me. I didn't want a partition, but at the same time I didn't want the Muslims to go away and be hurt, and I was just so mixed up. I just didn't want anyone to go anywhere. I wanted everything to be the way it was, and it was not going to be that way. So it was a very, very difficult time, but everyone was arguing. I can't tell you the bitterness of the arguments. It's worse than what we're doing now with Trump and the rest of the country. It was bitter, angry, and lethal almost. And we were not just arguing in our school. We were doing relatively civilized things in the school, even in the arguments. But what was happening all around us was dreadful. In Pakistan, Hindus and Sikhs were being hauled up, murdered, and thrown into wells, and their land and houses being seized. In India, we were doing exactly the same thing, killing Muslims, taking their houses away, and making them fly and run out of the country. My own family was escorting my uncle, who was a great patron of musicians. He loved classical Indian music. So I know there was one sarangi player, who was an instrument of this size, that he actually put on a plane to Pakistan, Bundu just to get out and be safe. Because what was happening if you put people on a train was both sides were doing this, that the train would arrive at the other side, whichever side they were going on, with dead people, nothing but dead people. Somebody had intercepted it and killed everyone. So what had happened now, there were two Pakistans. On our east, on this side of India, Come on, come on. Anyway, that side of India was Pakistan, East Pakistan, and this side of India was West Pakistan, and India was in the center. So both trains were going in every direction, people were being killed in every direction, and I remember my uncle taking Bundu Khan, the sarangi player, onto a plane. But then other things would happen, like we got a call saying, oh, Dr. Joshi, there's a group coming in, marching into his hospital. And so what happened was this dear friend of the family, a doctor, he had ran a hospital. This group was marching in, and he went out to try. He said, I can talk sense into them. I'll tell them, not, we're just doctors. Don't attack us. He went out, they shot him. So this was sort of a common thing that was going on. I had a cousin, my mother's brother's son, who was about 19. He went out of the house, and we didn't see him again for 6-7 days. And then when he came back, he was unrecognizable. He'd lost his mind. He was beaten up, had been beaten up. And in those days, the Hindus and Muslims were both doing it. For example, in the case of a Hindu, they would have to drop their pants to see if he was circumcised or not circumcised. He was circumcised, the other side, whichever side was doing bad things, was sort of attacked them and raped them and did horrible things. So these things were just happening on both sides, and property was being confiscated, and it was a time, I think, the worst time in my life. And I don't wish this on anybody. I just hope it never happens to anyone again. And refugees began pouring into Delhi from everywhere. Punjabi refugees for the main, because they were the closest to us. And I'd like to not end on this horrible note, but rather a nicer note. And I would like to tell you the story of a restaurant. Now, certain refugees who were coming in from, if I can ever get this, okay, so sort of from up here, there were refugees coming into Delhi carrying their pots and pans and whatever they could, and they are the ones who did cooking with a tandoor. India didn't know what a tandoor was. Nobody had seen a tandoor, and if you don't know, it was an earthen kind of vase, pot, that was embedded, and you used it for cooking tandoori foods. Nobody knew what they were at that time, except people who actually made them in the northwest of what was Punjab. So these refugees came with their earthen tandoors because they needed them along the way to cook their foods. And they brought these to Delhi, and they started a very humble restaurant called Moti Mahal. And in it, they served tandoori chicken. We'd never had anything like this before. They were very young chickens that had been marinated and quick roasted in this fiery tandoor. They were skewered, put in, and they came out. Then against the walls of the tandoor, they made a flatbread and stuck it on the sides of the walls, and those came out as naans. We'd never had food like this before. And I remember I was a young teenager at that time. I said, this is heaven, this is heaven. So the one good thing that came out of the partition was Moti Mahal and tandoori chicken. And I'll end there. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. And now we'll just shift to some discussion, and I will have these mics, check, to pass around as we go. But in the spirit of the classroom, and this being a public class, often in my class we have student service discussion leaders to get the discussion going. So I thought, what better idea than to have your granddaughter Jamila begin the discussion, since ostensibly you're also here on a family visit, right? Maybe Jamila doesn't think it's a great idea, but maybe if you'd like, just to kind of start us off with some comments or questions for your grandma.
Hi, Nani.
Hi.
So I guess I was curious throughout this because I didn't realize until I got to college the extent to which there was also a migration of people from India or from South Asia to other places in the Indian Ocean and around there. So I guess I was wondering, because you've traveled and written about food way beyond India too, the influence of other cultures in places like East Africa and the Caribbean, and how you've seen that develop, like Indian food.
With the abolition of slavery in the English Parliament, which was what, 1935, 6? Anyway, it's a date. It's in the 1830s somewhere. With the abolition of slavery, what were the British to do with all their land that they had all over South Africa, Guyana, Trinidad? They had a lot of property that needed to be farmed. They had sugarcane fields that needed to be farmed, and the slaves were not going to be there anymore and not going to be working for them. So what would they do? So I believe Gladstone's father, who was Prime Minister, his father wrote a letter to someone in Calcutta asking this company in Calcutta, saying, is there any way you can help us to get people to work the fields? And this gentleman in Calcutta wrote back, yes, sure, I can round up some people and send them to you, and you can use them as indentured labor. So indentured labor was established as a, if you can't have slaves, you can have indentured labor. And they were treated pretty much like slaves as well. So how did they collect them? This is a very interesting story that you hear if you go to the Indian end of it. And these people who were caught in this net were not educated people, so they don't have huge records of it, but they recorded it in song and folk song and various things like that. And I managed to find some people in Mauritius who have had songs, and somebody's written a wonderful book about all this. And I read that book, and there are other, if you go to the Durban Library, there are all kinds of sources which tell you what the rations of these people were on the boat. They got nothing. So what happened? They would kidnap people after there was a famine in places like Bihar in India, and Orissa in India, in places like Calcutta, which is in Bengal. They would kidnap them and say, we're going to send you for work somewhere. You'll work and you'll make money. And these people who had suffered a famine or whatever else very recently would either agree, or they just thought they were going to the next room to get a job. And they were duped and put on ships. And they had no sense of where they were going, no sense of how long the voyage from there to the Indies was, It was months and months and months, and they had no sense of it at all. And there's one wonderful, I don't know if I can remember all the words, a plaintive sort of song that one of them wrote down, because that's what they used to sing. Panhariya dhire chalo, boatman, go slowly. The sun is sinking into the west, and we don't know where we are going. Please go slowly. It's just so sad and so pathetic. So these people they didn't know where, and they were settled as indentured labor in places like Guyana and in places like Trinidad, and their lives were awful. I went to interview people in Trinidad, and I picked the oldest ones because I thought they would remember something. But it was actually so horrible for them, so horrible, that they chose to forget. They just chose, I'm not going to retain any of this, it's too horrible. And they just wouldn't. It's the people younger than them that remember the stories the older people told. But the older people who actually cut the sugar in that period, in the late 1800s, they actually have very little memory of it, those who are alive, and there are hardly any alive. And their kids barely remember the stories, but are willing to tell you a little bit of it. And you see their recipes. When you look at their recipes, they never got any wheat flour, which is, in India, you eat wheat flour. Your bread, your basic bread, is made out of wheat flour. And they never got it, so they started doing with white flour and making versions of double roti, or as it were. And even their own breads, they had to make them rise a little bit to have any texture or anything like that. So those recipes to me are so interesting, and the names that they call the dishes. For example, they call culantro, which tastes a little like green coriander. They call it coriander of the woods, which is kind of interesting. Bandhania, which is very interesting. So I just find the more research you do, the more you look into it and look into the history of all these things, it becomes more and more interesting to me anyway.
Thank you. Maybe if I can just put a question of my own to you. So cooking food is one thing, eating it is another, right? But I'm wondering about writing about food, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what has shaped you as a writer, or were there essays that really influenced you, or writers that influenced you, and then more specifically, cookbooks or kind of practical manuals that that you kind of modeled some of your own cookbook writing on.
And first of all, there's the ink in the vein.
So it's just it's just natural, right? Yeah.
It comes. I've written since
Yeah.
I was a little girl.
If you can speak into the microphone, please.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, in school and everything like that, I've always written. But I think I never thought about learning to write about food. I read a lot. I read everything, and certainly a lot of fiction and a lot of history. And I think if you read good writing, I always tell people, don't worry about learning to write about food. Eat the food, think about the food, but read books and learn how to write from reading books. And then what your thoughts are will find words. And those will be your words. They'll be no one else's words. They will be the way you see it. And that's what you'll put down.
Well, you make it sound so effortless. I guess it is the ink in the veins too, right? Let me just turn the discussion now over to students in my class and faculty who have come. Does anyone have a question to put to Ms. Jaffrey? I know you all spent some time reading from her memoir, so don't be shy. Any takers? Fair enough, please.
So I speak not as a professor, but really as a fangirl. You can see I've brought my copy for you to sign, but only because you spoke so much about the kind of distinct and yet kind of complementary influences of different religious traditions on your food, and I think it's really evident in the way that you write and have presented Indian food. I was just wondering if you had any. So my disclosure, I'm a political scientist, but I think a lot about ideas of nationalism and about the role of music and song and food in kind of thinking about nationalism, and so I was kind of curious, given the present political situation that we find ourselves in India, which is resonant across the globe, your thoughts on food, and on writing, and on the role that food might play or is playing in kind of contemporary politics of Hindu nationalism, and about what does it mean to be a writer of a book called Indian Cooking when India is being presented and molded in a way that might not necessarily reflect the way that you think of India?
I don't know how to answer that question, but I'll tell you something else, if that's all right, which may vaguely touch on this. Now, with our present Prime Minister in India, the question of Kashmir has come up. And I have found always Kashmir to be fascinating in terms of food. So if you look at the history of Kashmir, we are fighting over it, and Pakistan and India never stopped their battles over Kashmir and probably never will, and I don't know how that is going to end. But obviously, originally, it was all a Hindu area. And then when Islam came, Muslims started going in, and eventually an amazing kind of treaty was signed in which the Dogra kings said, this was in the 1800s, that nobody can buy land here. And I think they signed the treaty with the British. Nobody can buy land here except us. We are the only ones who can own land in Kashmir. So until now, why do other people cannot have land, and that's because of this law that came from the 1830 something. But I found that there's a very interesting phenomena in Kashmir if you go there, and I don't know what it has to do with the land owning part or not owning part, but certainly when we went, and I've been many times, is that you have to stay in hotels or in a houseboat because you can't own land there. So that's one thing. But the food of the Hindus and Muslims is different. And there's one spice in particular that makes it different. And that one spice which grows in Kashmir and grows in Afghanistan is asafoetida. Now, I found that utterly amazing, that is what separates two different peoples in the same land. And in Kashmir, such an interesting thing has happened that in Pakistan, in Lahore, I met this wonderful grandson of a wonderful poet, a Pakistani Urdu poet. Well, he was in India at one time. Anyway, this poet says that his family is a Kashmiri family, and they were converted to Islam 200 years ago, but not everyone. One part of the family stayed Hindu and one part of the family was converted. So now how does that family eat? The Muslim side of the family say, now we've turned Muslim, so we're not going to eat asafoetida from tomorrow. I mean, I would love to know the logistics of this particular change that happened. It's just, I don't know myself, but I find it terribly interesting. For example, haq, or karam ka saag, there are different ways of calling it, is a green that is eaten by every Kashmiri. That and rice is the staple for the poorest person. And this saag, this haq, is a green, rather like collard greens, and it's cooked with asafoetida and green chilies by Hindus, green and red chilies, and with garlic and green and red chilies by Muslims. That is the difference between the two. But how did the split happen? And when the split was happening, did one party say, I'm giving up garlic? Or did one party say, I'm now cooking with garlic? I would like to know. I would like to borrow my way to that time and try and understand these things. But I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, please.
So this is sort of a follow-up, but I'm curious about two different themes that came up. The one is that the sort of relative rapidity with which the sort of New World crops got incorporated into cuisine, it sort of gives you a perspective of a very transformational cuisine. On the other hand, you have this sense of Indian cuisine as something that has been sort of set in time for 300 years, and including two neighbors, one who uses one ingredient and the other won't use the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
And those seem like fundamentally different processes. Like on the one hand, you have this relatively rapid adoption of new ingredients to become available, and another a sort of set of rigidity. And I guess the question is like which model is right, and to what extent is it?
That's what I was saying. That in India, there's no rule.
But is your perception that if you sort of is it the case, for example, that for in large part the dishes that your grandmother made were the ones that her grandmother made, that it goes back 200
Well, you
years,
see,
or was it always modifying along the way?
it's very interesting that on days of fasting in my Hindu family, we go back in time and basically eat only dishes that were grown in India originally. Nobody seems to have focused on that. But we eat, pumpkins and things like that. And I say, why are we not eating this or that? They said, no. On this day of fasting, this is what we are going to eat. And those are all old Indian vegetables. They're not the new cauliflower and every peas that came in yesterday, as it were. They are the old ones that were original to India. So why do we do that? But we do. So there it is.
Other questions? Yeah, Laura.
So I have a few questions because I'm studying ethnography, and I was curious about the difficulties and struggles that you encountered when doing field research.
In what, sorry?
When doing field research, when you're going out and talking to people and interviewing them and just trying to get the lowdown on everything.
The only difficulties I encountered was in people not giving me recipes. and trying to leave one ingredient out. Because we don't, the thinking is, especially in places like Hyderabad, then you'll be as good as us. So why should we give it to you? So what I would do is ask 10 people the same recipe, and everybody would leave out a different ingredient. So by the end of it, I had my recipe. You learn how to do it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Thank you. Any other questions for Ms. Jaffrey? Well, maybe I can just follow up because the discussion seems to be touching a lot with Prerna's comment and your comment on food and identity, but then also food and authenticity. So I wonder if you get a question, just in teaching this course on food, everyone takes me all of a sudden to be now some expert on Indian food, which is certainly not the case. I love it and I'd like to learn more about it. But so I can only imagine for someone like you, who's been the kind of public face of this cuisine for so long, you get the question about a given restaurant. Well, but is that real Indian food? Is that the authentic Indian food? And this is such a simple question, but it's also such a kind of profound one that gets to some of the issues that have been raised here. So how do you answer that question?
Okay. Just let me not forget the question. I just want to say one other thing. That there is no Indian who cannot contradict me in the next second. Okay. This happens to me all the time, and
Duly
sometimes
noted.
they are right. They're right. Because there are so many aspects to India, and there's always somebody willing to say, but in my village, we don't do it this way, we do it this way. And they're probably right. So now this question of authenticity in a restaurant.
Yeah, good point.
You're not likely to find too much of that in a restaurant because what you call authentic Indian food, authentic to me, is food that is cooked in Indian homes. That to me is the real Indian food. And no restaurant, even in India actually, serves real home-style Indian food because you wouldn't leave your homes if you got the same thing. Most people used to go to restaurants to eat a richer, grander cuisine. It's not the same now, but certainly when I was younger, that's what you went to do. You didn't want your home food in a restaurant.
Right.
You wanted a richer, grander cuisine. But also, I think now this whole business of authentic. So you will go out for a real Gujarati meal there are places that make real food from a certain area of India, and there are women in their homes, they will serve you real food of whatever sort it is. And that is happening in India now. So if you want to, you can get the home version of it in most places, but not in all places.
Yeah. Thank you. Any last questions? Yeah, Holly.
Thank you so much. I wanted to follow up on some of the other comments and ask if you've encountered moments of fusion in between Hindu and Muslim food where, I don't know, you have the pumpkin and the meat and they combine.
Fusion, I think Indians have basically wholesale taken over Muslim food. And they cook it the way the Muslims cook it because they like it so much. I mean, those Indians who cook meats and like it the way the Muslims cook it, they try and copy it because that is the best recipe you can get, and it's usually wonderful. So I don't know if they even try and adapt it. They might adapt it to whatever they have at home or what's available, or certain meats that they don't eat, or they might use it for meats that Muslims don't eat. They might use it for pork, for example, and Muslims won't eat pork. So that kind of change may happen. But we certainly did it a lot for British food. So let me count the ways. I'll just give you one of them. Chops, lamb chops. So we take goat, not lamb, and we pound it, and we put garlic, green chilies, ginger on it as a marinade, and let it sit, and then we grill it like an English.